Tip that teacher, she's been teaching you. Skip the small change, slap down a 52. Welcome to Tips for Teachers. Welcome to my classroom. I'm Dr. Knack, and today's topic is instructional scaffolding. Instructional scaffolding is an essential tool in any teacher's toolkit. It is one of the primary things we teach to our pre-service teachers, and it's used primarily to teach students difficult procedural knowledge, how to do things, how to find slope, how to apply the scientific method, how to identify imagery in a poem. It's also one of the most misunderstood concepts in teaching and learning. The prevalent cliche for instructional scaffolding that it means I do, we do, you do, doesn't work. Showing students what to do, having them practice doing it in pairs or in small groups, and then doing it on their own is actually leaving out the most critical steps. So what I want to do with you today is review some of those key elements of instructional scaffolding that you can use it in your classroom. Generally speaking, the hardest things to teach take the most time. Any algebra teacher will acknowledge the fact that teaching students to understand the Cartesian plane or how to understand the XY axis takes more than 1, 2, or 3 classes. It takes repeated application, repeated attempts, learning from one's mistakes, and perhaps most importantly, explicit feedback on the process between the teacher and the student. So today I want to review with you some of those critical elements and talk about the kinds of knowledge that work best with instructional scaffolding. So there are 3 essential types of knowledge that we teach. The first one is declarative knowledge, which is knowledge of or about, the definition of imagery, for example. There's also procedural knowledge, and procedural knowledge is knowledge of how to do something, like how to apply the scientific method. And then there's conditional knowledge, and conditional knowledge is knowing when to apply a certain strategy in certain situations. Instructional scaffolding works best with procedural knowledge. And I want to review the fundamental steps for this process with you. Let me give you an example from my own experience. As an English language arts teacher, one of the key learning objectives is teaching students to identify, discuss the significance of an author's use of imagery. Now, I may spend a tremendous amount of time as a classroom teacher defining imagery, pointing it out in a student's read aloud. We may talk about the imagery and the things that it convey, but ultimately the learning objective requires me to teach students to recognize, identify, and interpret imagery entirely on their own. So how do we do this? When introducing a strategy to students, the first thing you need to do is to name the strategy and discuss its efficacy. Why this is important. Why am I teaching this to you? Why are we spending a couple of weeks in this classroom practicing in recognizing and interpreting imagery? So the first step is to explain to students why you're doing what you're doing. The second step is to model the strategy. So if I'm teaching how to recognize and interpret imagery, I'm going to put a poem on the document camera. I'm going to engage in a think aloud. And for those of you who are not familiar, a think aloud is where you write with a pencil in your hand or on the document itself so that the students can see it on the document camera. And you explain your thinking. For example, I might start by modeling how I pay attention to imagery by paying attention to words that appeal to the 5 senses. And I might just start underlining visual images or circling touch images or any other images associated with the 5 senses. Once I've modeled the strategy, it's time to be tentative And it's time to pair students together either in groups of two or to put them in small learning groups and give them, let's say, a continued stanza of the poem, have them try to apply the strategy I just did. The most important part of this instructional scaffolding is debriefing the process. So I do, they do, and now we're going to debrief and talk about how it went. So I may invite 2 or 3 groups of students up to the front of the classroom, put their marked up poem under the document camera, and have them think aloud and explain how they applied the strategy, why they did what they did, and why perhaps they underlined certain words or circled certain words. So the key here during debriefing is to make thinking visible, is to talk about the cognitive processes, to make them as explicit as we possibly can for every kid in the classroom. Once we debrief that strategy and invite students to talk about what they did and why, the next step is to provide feedback. And as a teacher, I need to do this immediately. And this is one of the critical missing elements of instructional scaffolding. So after each group of students comes to the front of the classroom and puts up their document and thinks out loud and debriefs and explains why they did what they did, I'm going to give immediate feedback to those kids, and so that the rest of the classroom can hear. And I'm going to say something like, I really like how you focused on words associated with sounds, because the poet seems to be really focusing on auditory imagery. Next time you try this, I suggest you also look for visual imagery, which is perhaps the easiest to find, and then look for parallels. So when it comes to feedback, I want to tell the kids what they're doing well and give them a specific strategy, a specific suggestion to make their application of that strategy even better. So then it's time for them to try it on their own. And now that we've debriefed this, we've done it as a classroom, we've talked explicitly about the steps involved, it's time for independent practice. So I might give the students an entirely new poem and ask them to circle or underline or mark up the text for the imagery. Then I might ask them to do a think, pair, or share, or I might ask them to just take some time themselves to think about why the author chose this kind of imagery. What effect does it cause? So now they're getting a chance to tentatively practice it on their own. And I can't stress enough the importance of the word tentative, because we're not looking for mastery at this step. We're not looking for kids to get it right. And it's critically important that you communicate to your students that getting it 100% correct is not what we're going for. We're going for growth. So every time I work with a student and look at their individual work on applying imagery, for example, I'm going to give them immediate feedback on what they're doing well and make a specific suggestion of what they could do next time to make it better. So these are the elements of instructional scaffolding that are missing and that are critically important. There has to be direct feedback to the student, making suggestions for improvement immediately after their application of the strategy. They go back and try it. They try it again. The teacher gives feedback. These steps are repeated as often as required until it's mastered. And I will tell you, teaching something like analysis as a writing teacher, it takes the whole school year until students finally get it right. But that's what instructional scaffolding is meant to do. It's meant to take that initial, this is what it looks like, which helps all kinds of learners, visual learners, kinesthetic learners, as well as auditory and visual learners. And we keep practicing. And the emphasis from the teacher has to be, I like what you're doing. Here's a suggestion you can make it even better. which means we're going to have to spend a little time in the classroom talking to kids about the importance of growth, not getting it 100% correct, but working towards that goal. And that's where the explicit feedback comes in.